And so I am now going to involve you all in a little experiment dealing with permanence. And it's going to be scientific, so we've got to have a baseline on how this is going to work. Everybody participating. If you're willing to raise your hand for our experiment, I mean, as in, all you have to do is raise your hand, raise your hand. Okay, there's my baseline. I didn't see any great dissenters. Even nobles get a hand up. I say, if noble can have a hand up, anybody can have a hand up, right? So you raise your hand if this applies to you. Okay, just some simple questions. Can you remember a prized possession, or does one come to mind, of a prized possession you have acquired within the past 10 years? Can you think of a prized possession within the past 10 years? Okay, everybody except Greg Arney. Greg is a poor man, doesn't own anything. Your truck, I'm going to put a hand up for you. How about this? Can you think of a prized possession from your teen years? Something you say, yeah, that was a prize. Okay, a few or less hands. Just out of curiosity, do you still have it? Anyone still? Okay, some people, a few less hands. Okay, let's push it back. A prized possession from your childhood. Can you think of one? Yeah, that was a prize. Okay, still not all hands, some coming up. Just out of curiosity, does anybody still have that possession? Okay, some do. All right. Okay, now let's go a little further back. How many in here, raise your hand if you know where your father or mother worked or / works. Okay, all right. Let's make it a little harder. Do you know of a significant contribution that your father or mother made at their work? Something you know. Still a fair amount. Yeah, it's kind of tied in. You're not sure, Norma. You kind of went up and then picked your nose. I don't know. Okay. Well, let's go back a little further. Raise your hand if you know what or where your grandfather or grandmother worked. Wow, that's not bad. This is an attached crowd here. Okay, if you know or have seen the home of your great-grandparents. Your great-grandparents. Must be a Midwest thing, man. You guys really do know some stuff. Okay, let's continue on. Do you know a social center where your great-great-grandparents hung out? Somewhere, maybe they were well known at a church or a club or something like that. Great-great-grandparents. Okay, all right. Well, that's still Jennifer might have it. She's just calculating back. Let's see, what generation are we? Let's go back one more. Who knows? Raise your hand if you know the town where your great-great-great-grandparents lived. The town of your great-great-great-grandparents. Okay. And no cheaters in here, because Brenda Anderson had her hand up all the way to the end and found, well, yeah, Ancestry.com. I just looked at it. No. I'm talking, through normal means. Okay, here comes a question. Do you know a significant accomplishment of, and that's not immigration or something like that, not that, something else, a significant accomplishment of your great-great-great-grandparents? Significant accomplishment? Really? Vicki, I just got to ask, what was it?
One of them was the founder of Hartford, Connecticut.
Oh, okay, all right. And you, Mindy?
Grandfather was the president of the horse races in Kentucky.
Oh, wow. So really that far back. Okay. How about this? Since you guys are, how about your great-great-great-grandparents? No, okay. I finally knocked out the hands. Well, let me put it this way. When you think of it, even though we went back, and that's impressive, we still had 2 hands to pretty much to the end of this thing with the great-great-great. That's really not all that far back. Oh, are you showing off, Mike?
My great-great-great-grandfather
farm in New York to play the piano for Barnum and Bailey Circus.
Is that right? Okay. So you had,
Circus and started a music store in Kentucky.
okay. And that, so there are some stories. There are some interesting things came down. There's 3, and that's really something because all of us had to stop and go, whoa, you really know something that far back. And it's really not all that far. When you look at generation to generation, it's amazing how quickly, and we're talking fairly broad questions of our own bloodline, and it fades into oblivion fairly quickly, doesn't it? Fades into oblivion fairly quickly. So, all right, so you're driving home the point that we come and we go and nobody remembers us. Thank you, Pastor. Thank you for that uplifting message. I can go home and know I go into oblivion. Well, there's a reason we're taking this strategy. There's actually a point to this pointing out that our lives are so temporary. As we look at the idea of eternity or an eternal reward, if we're going to look at anything, first we have to see how much we need it, how little we have it, and then how great it is. Only then do we really appreciate it. So we're starting from the fact of the idea there is this thing within the Christian faith, a promise of an eternal reward, and we know virtually nothing of eternity. None of us, even those with the best connections in here, we went back 100 years and probably, if we're lucky, who knows, maybe somebody might have even hit another generation. But boy, do we slide into oblivion pretty quickly, don't we? We slide in so quickly. So we're going to look at this promise of eternal reward. And we started last week, we said as we looked at it, this is why it kind of turned into a series within the series, as we got to the end, that the early church had consolidated some teaching on this fairly quickly because they knew how temporary life was. And it was something that is known today either as the 5 heavenly crowns or the 5 crowns of eternal reward, but some way the idea of the 5 crowns. And we said last week, no, it's not like Pokemon, got to get them all. It's really more the fact that there is this eternal reward, and we looked at 5 levels of it, or we're about to explore them. And in these crowns, the first crown that we're looking at is the Crown Imperishable. What does it mean to have this reward, whatever it might be, and we'll get deeper into that as we go, but imperishable, what does that mean? Well, the idea of the crown we'll see is mainly something that comes through the Apostle Paul, but we're going to back up to a verse, I think, or a passage you're probably very well aware of, and it is amazing what Jesus says in just a few loaded sentences. And we're going to start there and take that apart on the idea of what lasts and what doesn't last. Matthew 6:19, Jesus starts like this here. Do not lay up for yourselves treasures on earth where moth and rust destroy and where thieves break in and steal, but lay up for yourselves treasures in heaven where neither moth nor rust destroys and where thieves do not break in and steal. For where your treasure is, there your heart will be also. And we all know that if anything, if you were to have a line memorized from that passage, it's probably the last one. Your treasure, where your treasure is, there your heart is also. But we're going to back up. The loaded sentences are really in the beginning. So we're going to build on them piece by piece and see what Jesus said in just a few lines here. Starting with, do not lay up for yourselves. Not going any further than just stopping there. Do not lay up for yourselves. In the Greek, it was a little stronger language. It was not just laying up, it was hoarding. Do not hoard for yourselves. Hoarding is really not that healthy a habit, is it? As a matter of fact, there are estimated by the psychology community today, 19 million Americans have a hoarding disorder. Now keep in mind, that's not hoard, that's people who their lives are really suffering. because of this compulsion to hoard. And hoarding would be defined this way: an obsessive attachment to items that in reality are quite useless. An attachment to items that are in reality quite useless. I think if we look from God's point, we all have a hoarding disorder, don't we? What we attach to. Wanted to just throw out how easy it is with a personal example on this. I even got away in the first service with Kathy looking at me. So Kathy and I are in the story. And we're kind of cutting edge like everyone else in here, is that we order stuff online. Everybody orders stuff online. And when you order stuff online, guess what? It comes in boxes. And if you remember, boxes used to be empty cardboard boxes. What a commodity to hold on to. Because, man, you can store stuff in them. You can send your kids presents in them. You can do all this stuff with cardboard boxes. Everybody, you can't have too many cardboard boxes unless you order online. Because we started saving all our cardboard boxes. And we realized that they were starting to pile up. Soon there was a room dedicated to cardboard boxes, all empty, waiting to be filled with something that probably should be thrown out anyway. All these boxes. So eventually we had to reform. Now, I want to share a scientific fact with you. This is established. You can find it on the internet, so it's got to be true. Cardboard boxes, Minnie and I just had a laugh at that one. Cardboard boxes attract cockroaches. They like to eat them, and they can live in them. Boy, if you can eat the house you live in, how great, right? You can. So I had to laugh at myself as that here, this pastor family, and if Jesus was here, he'd have to lower the bar. Instead of saying what he did, he'd have to say, do not hoard for yourself cardboard boxes where cockroaches and bugaboos tend to eat and destroy. I mean, gee, the pastor and I've got a lower standard. Hoarding, so easy. So what's he getting at with just the idea of hoarding? Ultimately, it is so futile. It is so useless to lay up for yourselves treasures in this world. We even have a clinical name for it now. Hoarding disorder. Jesus was way ahead of his time, wasn't he? Do not lay up for yourselves treasures on earth. Let's build on that. Where the moth destroys. This would have resonated big time. We live in a culture now where everything's mass produced. It's nothing. You want fabric, you go to the Walmart and you can buy a roll of whatever you want. But consider a time when he's saying this, that in fact, every piece of cloth you looked at was handmade. It was hand woven. Fabric in the time of Christ was actually a currency. You could get paid in fabric. You could be bribed in fabric. You could be compensated in fabric. As a matter of fact, they literally, in that day, wore their wealth on their body. They excavated from a Roman lady in high society. She had, they just had fragments, of course, of it now, but it was a garment that had been a pattern put into it, threaded in, and the thread was solid gold. So the pattern was solid gold. Imagine what that dress would be worth even in our day. On the other hand, a moth could destroy the main portion of that, and the dress would be eventually worthless. It is amazing. Fabric represents wealth. As he's speaking, it represents the wealth you can have, and a simple insect could destroy your wealth. How vulnerable it is. Why hoard it? Why hoard it? Do not lay up for yourself treasures on earth that rust destroys. And that's one of those words that's a little bit iffy when they were translating, because they had to try and make it fit into the English, and they used the word rust. But brosis really means to feed upon, to feed. And so how does that work in? don't get something that gets fed upon. Well, here is Jesus. He's in this era, the transitioning out of the Bronze Age into the Iron Age. And what does iron do? Real easy, doesn't it? It's moisture. There's even bacteria that feeds upon rust. Who would be using a lot of this cutting-edge technology? In their day, it's like our day. The military would be using it. The military used all kinds of iron if you were going to find it. What does the military represent? Well, security. We feel secure in our nation because we have a strong military. So there's an idea with the iron, the idea of a confidence of security, but in something that can rust so quickly. There's another way this word brosis could come in. It meant to feed upon, so it could also give the picture of vermin, insects eating up grain, that type of idea. So if they were kind of like the Midwest there, you go out, you have this great harvest this year, and you take all that grain, you put it into a silo. Let's say next year is even better, and there's more silos and more grain. And boy, you start getting all these silos filled with grain, you start feeling pretty secure. If there's ever a famine, I'm okay. If I really need to sell some assets, grain is an asset, I'm okay, I can sell this. But the silos of the day were really kind of sheds. And what happened is that you had things like rats and bugs and worms that could get in, and they were literally eating up your grain, even as it was stored in the silos. You couldn't count on it. Give it a little time, that security would get eaten away. Wow. Security in our wealth, has that changed much in human mindset? As we think of even our day, we might build our wealth and our security a little bit different. Wow, we do it all the time. Just wait until it's winter. Wait until the first broadcast that says there's a major snowstorm coming. And then the day before, try and go and find some groceries, right? So we stock up our fridge, and boy, now we feel secure. Well, until a snowstorm takes out the power, and then we lose all the food in the fridge. But we have our retirement plans and things like that, and it's good to have those type of things. But all we needed was 9/11 to see what would happen to that security, right? These things are not as secure as we would like to think. They are not as secure as we like to think. Security in the wealth that we're counting on is extremely vulnerable. Do not lay up for yourselves treasures on earth where thieves break in and steal. Once again, a curious thing that was translated, because the word there really didn't mean break in. It meant to burrow. It meant to dig. It meant to excavate. Well, how does that fit in? Well, we live in a society where we have brick houses and wood houses and even steel-sided houses. The idea of somebody breaking in your house, they're probably not going to dig a hole through the wall. If anything, that would be kind of noisy, wouldn't it? But think of the day on which this is being said, how this would resonate. People worked for a half a penny a day. It would take you time to accumulate any wealth if you had. And once you did, there weren't any great banks. You would probably have your little bag of gold or silver, whatever coins you had, and you had them buried in your dirt floor in your house that was made out of dried mud, either plaster or brick. There you are. So let's say I picked on them the first service, I'll pick on him again. There's Steve, that nefarious character, and he finds out that I have my little bag of gold hidden in my bedroom. All he would have to do is dig through 5 inches of mud, and he has everything I owned, just like that. Wow, wouldn't that resonate? We think we have so much, and all somebody has to do is do a little digging, and now they own what you own. Not that much different from today, is it? You know, how many of the elderly have been scammed out of their entire life savings in our culture? How many phone calls a day or a week do you get that is a scammer call? I just found an app, by the way. I didn't put it on, but I was reading about it. It's Vengeance on Scammers. Apparently, this, you have to buy their service, but then they'll start calling the scammers. It sounded kind of interesting. But the bottom line is this. Once again, it is ultimately vulnerable and ultimately futile. There's nothing you can hoard in this life that can't be taken away from you like that. There's nothing. And then he sums it all up. Jesus in Matthew 6:24, a verse, and then once again, another translation that needs a tweak. No one can serve two masters. Well, that's right on. For either he will hate the one, love the other, or he will be devoted to the one and despise the other. You cannot serve God and depending on your translation, it may say money or it may say mammon, and everybody says, what in the heck is mammon? And you wonder what's going on. Well, in the original Greek, there was no problem with it because it wasn't talking a substance. Memonis was not really a substance, it was a mentality. It was the mentality that you put all your trust in the material things you own. All your trust in the material things you own. The Greeks may have used that word. We have another word for it in our day. We call it materialism. Materialism. And materialism is a really a kind of a deceptive thing because when you think of it, it means to put all your trust in your material stuff. But that doesn't mean the stuff is immoral itself. If you have a house, there's nothing wrong with that. If you have a nice car, there's nothing wrong with that. If you have a good retirement plan, there's nothing wrong with that. It's not immoral things. It's not even these things gained in an immoral way. I worked really hard, so I have deserved to have my house and my car and that. So it's not even that. It is speaking to a priority. It is speaking to a priority. Materialism is defined in two ways. One, a tendency to consider material possessions and physical comfort as more important than spiritual values. Two, the doctrine that nothing exists except matter and its movement and its modifications. Can you see how the two are combined? If you're one, you're probably the other. There is nothing but the matter of this universe. So I put all my value in all this material stuff. How do I gauge success in my life? By how much I own. How nice is my house? How nice is my car? How nice are my clothes? All the material things I base it on. Here's a question for you. It can be done in such a respectable way. Everybody likes, if somebody came in here in tatters and somebody else comes in a really nice suit, chances are we take notice of the nice suit, don't we? That's what we tend to do. That's a successful person. We want them to come into our church. So can materialism be in the Christian church? Oh no, that's not possible, is it? How could it be? Because I just read earlier that Jesus said, do not hoard material things. But it can, huh? Interesting thing, I'll just throw this out. Google when you go home, because everything on the internet is true. Minnie and I already established that. Google prosperity theology or prosperity gospel. And it's interesting, you'll probably find some pretty good definitions of what it is. And then you'll probably come up with some names that are associated with churches that are known for being prosperity gospel. Oh, yeah, it is so easy. And I'm not going to say anything because I'm the pastor who hoarded cardboard boxes. So, but it is so easily to end up in this situation. And Jesus, he hit some things that resonated in his time that when we understand what he was talking about, resonate in our time, and it's still the same dynamic. You can lose it all like that. You can lose it all like that. It's not permanent. It's not permanent. But there is something that is. And then he goes on to say about that. But we're going to switch gears a little bit because we're going to go in now and look at eternal reward. Now, Paul is a apostle, a disciple of Christ, and so he puts his own words, which, by the way, if you can't take the thoughts of Christ and put them in your own words, and maybe you don't quite have them yet. If we have to pair it, we're not really there yet. And it's an interesting thing when you think of Paul and these early disciples. We talk about temporary in our life. Think of how temporary life was in his time. The government didn't even keep very good records. You could disappear from existence so easily. And yet, it is these people who are so convinced about eternity that they make it the central part of their message. They are so convinced that this becomes at the heart of the gospel, the idea of eternal reward. And this is where we start in with the idea of crowns. Paul used this a lot. For example, he's encouraging the church in Corinth. In 1 Corinthians 9:24, he's writing that picture of the Olympic Games kind of thing in his day. Each competitor must exercise self-control in everything. They do it to receive a perishable crown. We, an imperishable crown. Here's Paul talking, and what does he really mean? What's this perishable and imperishable? What did it mean to him even as he was speaking in his language? Well, let's do something else. Paul is explaining what Jesus said about what's eternal and what's not. Now, let's use the Apostle Peter to explain what Paul means down the road in his words. Peter didn't use crown. He would explain it more like this. 1 Peter 1:3-6. Blessed be the God and Father of our Lord Jesus Christ. By his great mercy, he gave us new birth into a living hope through the resurrection of Jesus Christ from the dead, that is, into an inheritance, imperishable, undefiled, and unfading. It is reserved in heaven for you. And of course, qualifying the you, this is going to people who are in a living relationship with Christ, who by God's power are protected through the faith for salvation ready to be revealed in the last time. This brings you great joy, although you may have to suffer for a short time in various trials. The word perishable in the Greek, it meant pretty much what it means in ours. Let's say you go to the grocery store and you buy your canned goods and you buy your perishables. And milk, yes, that would be a perishable. We know where Marilee's mind is. She's worried about her lactose. So you bring home your perishables. Now for me, Marilee, I wasn't thinking of milk. I got thinking of lettuce. Have you ever brought home this nice fresh head of lettuce, put it in the back of your crisper, and then forgot that it was there for, say, 2 months? You open your crisper, and at the back of the crisper is a pile of goo that's this ugly brown, right? I know all about it. I do it all the time. So this is perishable. Perishable is when you're reduced to this kind of sludge. The thing that we go after in this life, I paid good money for that head of lettuce, Kev, and it turned into goo. This is perishable goods. Perishable. Imperishable then becomes the opposite. And he points this out, that it isn't something that's going to fade. It's not going to turn into goo. Think of the best material thing that you have. Maybe for you, maybe it's that golden trophy that you won as a baseball champion in high school. Or maybe it's a new car. Maybe it's a house. Could be anything. Whatever your recent toy for big boys is. It could be anything. And right now, you know how it is. We've all bought something new. There it is, shiny and new, and you have a thrill when you use it, look at it, whatever. But I can guarantee you in a few years, it's not so shiny, and you're not so thrilled. We get used to things pretty quickly. When we talk of the imperishable, where what Peter's talking about is this reward from Christ never loses its luster. We'll get in time what we're talking about, but it is something we can start here that never loses the shiny newness. In a million years, no matter what, it not only will it have its luster, it will have the same thrill for you that it had from the very first day. It never fades. It is undefiled, he says. Now in the Greek, the words meant it would never be deformed, debased, or lose its vitality. It would never be soiled. It would never become dirty. Undefiled. It will always be as great as the first time you saw it, the first time you experienced it. Peter speaks of a timeless thrill, and he says it's your inheritance. It's for you. It is something very personal about it. It's protected by God himself. It will bring you great joy. Between listening to Peter and Paul and Jesus, we get an idea of what the perishable and the unperishable are. But let's bring in a qualifier here. It's one that I really appreciated from William Barclay when he was talking about this eternal reward. You know, this is, hopefully we're getting the idea of just how precious an eternal reward would be. No matter what we put else to it is defining it, that how precious it would be. But even the most unimaginable value is of no value to people who don't appreciate the value. Okay? Makes sense. Give you an earthly example. I don't know if anybody else remembers this story. I haven't asked, but I think it goes back to the 1980s when computers were still very big and very expensive. This computer was getting shipped by Bush pilots, and somehow the plane went down in the jungle. It wasn't Mike, because Mike's still here. But this computer, as the story goes, got lost in the jungle, so they were frantic to find it. It, lo and behold, got found by primitive people, primitive village, found this thing, and by the time the owners got to where this thing was, they found the computer completely scrapped, but boy, were they enjoying that big box it came in. This primitive people had, bottom line, they had no appreciation for the value of that computer, but, they were all about just the trappings, just the box. Is that really that much different than we are? We settle for the wrapping when God has the incredible reward waiting. The thing is that a heavenly reward, this eternal thing, is eternal because it's the nature of God. God is eternal. So you have this thing, this reward that is godly in its nature, godly in its timing, godly in its use. So if you have no use for God, these rewards would mean nothing to you. So is it any surprise that we live in a world that would laugh at you for even talking about eternal reward? It means nothing to anyone but those who are in connection with God. Nothing to anyone else. Well, let me turn that around a little bit as we talk about the eternal and the not so eternal. We can understand how the world goes after the immediate. However, if we're saying we understand how much value eternal reward is, how hungry are you for it? Really? How much appreciation do you have for it? Really? Because that would be a direct indicator of where you are with God. Is how valuable an eternal reward was to you. It certainly was for Jesus, certainly was for Paul and Peter. And I don't say that in any way as like shape up or anything. I'm just saying here, you want an indicator to know how you're doing in your spiritual health? There's one for you. Jesus, Peter, Paul, none of them leave us hanging either. Just to wrap it up a little bit, they tell us how to acquire the crown imperishable, how to acquire this. We're told to not lay up stuff on this earth, but to lay up our treasure in heaven, because where your treasure is, your heart will be. Paul tells us, he concludes that don't run with uncertainty, don't box the air. just swinging wildly, but subdue your body to get some discipline to yourself. Peter talks about, although you may have to suffer for a short time. Bottom line comes down to this. Laying up is a very intentional thing. Day by day, we lay stuff up. What are we laying up? What are we collecting to ourselves? Day by day, what are we practicing? How intentional are we about achieving the reward that is supposed to be out there for us? It's going to involve self-discipline, even brutal self-discipline if you talk to Paul. And we live in an imperfect world. We live in a world that's unfair, so unfair things happen. There's suffering that you shouldn't have to suffer, but you do. Well, what is that telling us? It means it's going to involve patience, it's going to involve endurance, and it's going to involve perspective. Yes, I'm suffering unfairly, but only for a short while. It's nothing compared to what I will get. Talking about, this is maybe kind of apropos, talking about missionary pilots, there's another one that Mike and I probably know quite well, a fellow by the name of Jim Elliot. Very famous pilot. And I think there's a switch there. Ah, there we go. There's Jim and his kids. And Jim was in South America. Eventually, what happens is that Jim was killed by the tribe he was trying to reach in the service of his mission work. The amazing part of the story is his wife Elizabeth ultimately goes back and converts to Christianity, the very tribe that killed her husband. But where we're going with Jim on this is that actually goes back to his time in school. He had a quote written that he came up with, actually. It's a thought of his. He shared with some people in college even who were having some trouble and struggles. And the quote went like this: "He is no fool who gives what he cannot keep to gain what he cannot lose." He is no fool who gives what he cannot keep to gain what he cannot lose. You know what Jim Elliot just did there? He took the words of Christ and put them in his own words. He took the words of Paul and Peter in the scripture and put it in his own words. And if you were to ask Jim Elliot what all that stuff meant about eternity and not eternity, he would tell you, it is no fool, he is no fool who gives what he cannot keep to gain what he cannot lose. So we step back, being honest with ourselves, what do we really think successful living is? Where are we really going after rewards? Even as good church people, here we are, where are we really interested in storing up our rewards? If we look at Jim Elliot and everything else that comes back from things he said, we can know this. Depending what we're going after, we're either wise or we're fools. What are you? Wow, what a pointed question, huh? The way you are going after things in your life, are you wise or are you a fool? We have a choice. We have a choice.